Good evening, everybody, and a very, very big welcome. I am delighted to see you all here, and particularly, of course, as we've all been saying, it's fantastic to actually be here in person for our 2021 Foundation Lecture. I'm extremely pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Linda Colley, who's the Shelby MC Davis 1958 Professor of History at Princeton, having previously held chairs at Yale and the LSE. Linda is, of course, very well known to many people here and connected in Cambridge and indeed completed her PhD here. Having originally focused on 18th century England and being highly regarded for her expertise in imperial and global history, Linda's interests have evolved more widely, and she's now known also for understanding the development and fracturing of the UK and more broadly for issues around identity. In her own words, Linda says, "I've always sought to combine academic, archival and scholarly research with experimenting with different forms of writing and reaching out to different kinds of readers and audiences." In that context, I vividly remember Linda's set of 15 lectures which were broadcast on Radio 4 in advance of the Scottish referendum. It may indeed be time for another series, I think. And way back, my first personal contact was listening to Linda's 1999 Prime Minister's Millennium Lecture on Britishness of the 21st century. She was then, and always has been, both incisive and challenging to the status quo and to complacent thinking. I'm also very pleased that Linda's husband, Professor Sir David Cannondine, has joined us. It's a real privilege to have both of you here with us this evening. After Linda has delivered her lecture, Professor Mike Kenny will chair a couple of questions. I think we might be quite tight for time, but we do want to try. Professor Colley's lecture this evening is on the drawbacks of political stability, the British case. Linda, you're really welcome.
Good evening, everybody. It's a great honour and pleasure to be here, and I'm most grateful for the invitation. I thought I'd start this lecture with a description of a controversial British Prime Minister. An old Etonian, he was nonetheless something of an outsider, and his rise to the top may be attributed both to his own extreme ambition, ruthlessness, and journalistic gifts, and to a tendency among opponents to underestimate him. What most ensured his ascendancy, though, was a major alteration in relations between Britain and continental Europe. Because of this change, this man was able to outmaneuver rivals, consolidate his power, then force through alterations to the electoral system, systematically confine state patronage to supporters, and undermine opposition groupings in Parliament by accusing them of a lack of patriotism while simultaneously appropriating some of their more attractive policies. To be sure, he was always a polarising figure. Reactions in London, Scotland, and Ireland especially were persistently hostile. Intellectuals, too, were generally scornful, often accusing him of blatant corruption. Cartoonists and satirists, meanwhile, mocked his tendency to put on weight and his belated marriage to a mistress almost 25 years his junior. Yet for all this, he remained Britain's Prime Minister for over 2 decades. As this final detail suggests, any resemblances between the individual I have just evoked and a political figure active in Britain today are largely, though not entirely, coincidental. The politician I have just been describing is in fact Robert Walpole, who was born in 1676 to a minor gentry family in Norfolk. His rise to preeminence owed much to the fact that in 1714, a German dynasty, the Hanoverians, succeeded to the British throne and promptly switched royal favour away from politicians calling themselves Tories to Walpole's own party, the Whigs. Climbing to the head of a faction among these Whigs, Walpole secured the premiership in 1721, famously becoming the first individual in British history to be styled Prime Minister, a position he retained until his enforced resignation in 1742. Some 2 centuries later, this long tenure of power attracted the attention of another ambitious and controversial man, namely J.H. Plum, alias Jack Plum, one-time professor of modern English history at this university and master of Christ's College. In 1967, he published The Growth of Political Stability in England, 1675 to 1725, a book organised around Walpole's political career. As Plum saw it, Walpole's rise and protracted grip on the premiership were an outcrop and accelerant of something very much larger. Back in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, Plum wrote, England had been a polity where men killed, tortured, and executed each other for political beliefs. But as the 18th century progressed, and in large part because of Walpole's actions, England and increasingly Britain as a whole acquired by contrast political stability. This shift, moreover, was of more than simply local British significance. Historians had been too often attracted, Plum argued, to the phenomenon of political revolution. Yet there was as great a need, he insisted, if not greater, to study the reverse process. Just how did societies come to accept a pattern of political authority and the institutions that are required for its translation into government? And that's what Plum sought to do. In my lecture this evening, I want to revisit this concept of political stability, both as something that arguably occurred and or was perceived as occurring in the British past, and as something that appears to be progressively lacking and at risk in Britain's present. But some Cambridge background first. J.H. Plum, I think it's fair to say, was a tormented and difficult man. In part, I suspect this was because he was privately gay. Being homosexual in Cambridge between the wars, which was when he arrived here, was not necessarily an obstacle to acceptance and success. But it helped if you were also an epicene, confident youth of upper middle class background or above. Plum, however, was short, tubby, provincial, and working class. As a writer in the Times Literary Supplement put it only this year, Plum was, I quote, the son of a shoe clicker in a Leicester boot factory. And the snobbery that suffuses that description gives one some sense, I think, of what it must have been like for Plum when he joined Cambridge in the 1930s, challenged both by his sexuality and by his own and others' reactions to his social origins. As a mere graduate student of Plum's back in the 1970s, I was largely ignorant of this troubled background. But I have since come to believe that some of the vituperation and gossip that residually still surrounds this undoubtedly difficult man is actually unfair and gets in the way of a proper appreciation of his writings, of which The Growth of Political Stability is incontestably the best. It is a book that still rewards reading, not least in our current circumstances. Of course, like all books, it contains faults and omissions. As later historians, including myself, have pointed out, Plum attributed too much transformative impact to Robert Walpole himself. He paid insufficient attention to the degree to which a stronger, more resilient British state was already emerging before Walpole's ascent to power, and to the extent to which disorder continued at times to characterize Britain long after Walpole's fall in 1742. Moreover, anyone reading The Growth of Political Stability now, in the early 21st century, is likely to find the book overly inward-looking. As Plum himself came to recognize, it almost entirely omits the significance of Britain's overseas warfare and empire, and the extent to which rising levels of stability and acquiescence within this polity can be attributed in part to its export of aggression and ambition to other shores, a point to which I will return. All that said, Plum was correct in drawing attention to some real and important shifts. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, as earlier, England, along with Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, experienced successive contentious changes in royal dynasty, but not so after 1714. In the 17th century, England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland were all convulsed by vicious civil warfare. But after 1700, while civil commotions continued for a time in Scotland and in Ireland for much longer, no further civil wars or revolutions swept through the island of Great Britain as a whole. And while in 1688 there was a successful large-scale Dutch invasion of England, after that date, the island of Great Britain never experienced another successful foreign armed invasion. Partly as a result of these transformations, there emerged and coalesced what one might style as an influential political theology. From being once viewed as a polity characterized by high levels of disorder and acute division, a heap of conspiracies, rebellions, murders, massacres, revolutions, banishments, the very worst effects that faction, cruelty, rage, madness, hatred, and ambition could produce. As the novelist Jonathan Swift put it, Great Britain came widely to be perceived, not universally perceived, but widely to be perceived, both at home and abroad, as a prime exponent of pragmatic, gradual, and atypically peaceful political evolution. By the late 19th century, variations on this kind of self-congratulatory viewpoint could be found indeed among Anglos on both sides of the Atlantic. What I see in England and America, declared E.A. Freeman, Regius Professor of History at Oxford in 1892, is stability, the power to make changes without pulling the whole political fabric down on the head of the reformers. Further buttressed by American success in the Second World War and Britain's own resistance and avoidance of invasion after 1939, such flattering notions persisted well into the later 20th century. It's worth considering how much of the plotline of Plum's Growth of Political Stability, published, as I say, back in 1967, was shaped by these optimistic, confident, even complacent assumptions, by a belief that Britain, like the USA, had managed to secure the key to sound and stable good government, and was able, therefore, to bestow political as well as economic advice on other less fortunate parts of the globe. The title of an American official publication issued in 1976 is surely suggestive. Reports on Political Instability Abroad. Political instability, in other words, was something that happened elsewhere, outside the supremely fortunate world of Anglo-America. On both sides of the Atlantic, things look rather different now. It remains the case, of course, that compared to many other regions of the world, the UK, like the USA, is still relatively stable. It is the case, too, that many of Britain's anxieties and troubles today also afflict other states in the West and beyond the West. As the outgoing German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, observed only last month, the world is in anything but a stable condition. But the UK faces some more specific challenges to its real and perceived political stability. Let me touch on just some of them. First, to a greater degree than any other state anywhere, Britain has had to make an abrupt transition since the Second World War from being a global power of sorts to becoming just a part of a single region of the world. This transition has been widely discussed and argued over, of course. Indeed, it has been denied. But some of its destabilizing consequences have not been fully appreciated, and yet they have been significant. Among other things, the UK's one-time power overseas operated in the past as a safety valve at home. At one level, this polity's global reach meant that millions of British and Irish young men, often otherwise unemployed, were swept up over the centuries to serve as soldiers and sailors, and frequently transported overseas, where they often did damage to other people, but they didn't do damage at home. At another level, South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, along with another one-time set of colonies, the United States, supplied many millions more British and Irish people with access to jobs, new lands, and a chance for a fresh start. Between 1846 and 1850 alone, some 80% of all emigrants leaving Europe for other continents came from these islands, from Britain and the island of Ireland. Without these overseas outlets and opportunities, the unprecedented population growth here that Thomas Malthus worried about in the 1790s, and the labour unrest and urban squalor which Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels charted expectantly in the 19th century, would surely have proved far more combustible. Even in the wake of the First World War, London was careful to devise emigration schemes for its demobilized troops, anxious with good cause that these young men trained to violence might have been alienated by the horrors of the trenches and possibly radicalized by the recent Bolshevik revolution in Russia. Here, then, was an important and very long-lasting component of such growth of political stability as occurred in these islands, one dependent less on developments at home than on successful and protracted expansionist forays overseas. There was another way, too, in which one-time British formal and informal empire worked to diffuse domestic tensions. In all societies, the most dangerous and articulate political dissidents tend not in the main to be the very poor, but rather educated and or aspiring individuals whose ambitions and hopes may have been frustrated in some way. For a long time, Britain's empire and global reach served as a safety valve in this respect too. Over the centuries, British colonized and British influence overseas spaces provided opportunities not just to proconsuls, administrators, and umpteen traders and businesses from these shores, but also to multitudes of scientists, lawyers, doctors, architects, engineers, and even, as Dr. Caitlin Harvey of this college is showing, otherwise unemployed academics. A quite disproportionate number of these educated and ambitious folk who found an outlet for their talents in British-dominated spaces abroad were Scottish. And it is hardly accidental that the rapid reduction of these British overseas outlets, especially since the 1960s, has coincided with a rising appetite in Scotland for independence. Seceding from the old Union of the UK, now stripped of most of its global goodies, and campaigning instead to rejoin the European Union, which after all possesses its own jobs and patronage opportunities, may seem now to ambitious Scots to be a strategic move, even apart from issues of nationalism. As its close interdependence with overseas expansionism and aggression suggests, British political stability has not always proved in the past to be a wholly benign and benevolent phenomenon. This is also true, I would argue, of some of political stability's repercussions here at home, not least as regards to constitutional development. Political stability can, to be sure, mean adept, peaceful, and effective flexibility in the face of change and challenges. But long, persistent political stability can also bring with it complacency, a reluctance to innovate, and a perpetuation of self-interested and entitled political and economic elites. Both of these trends have been evident here in the UK. Political stability is not always an unmixed blessing. The political system that Robert Walpole ran and partly created was, for instance, both successful and in some ways oligarchical, corrupt, and inimical to electoral growth and initiative. Before Walpole's rise, the size of the English, not British, but English electorate seems to have been expanding very fast. By the later 18th century, however, this had ceased to be the case. And despite 3 Reform Acts during the 19th century, by 1914, the UK actually possessed a narrower electorate as a proportion of its population at that time than any other European state, barring Hungary. As we wear our red poppies at the moment, think that many working class men who went to the trenches in the First World War had never voted, could not vote. Moreover, because unlike large parts of Europe and the Americas, Britain did not experience a successful political revolution during the 18th or 19th centuries, or a foreign invasion, say, which might have required its rulers to retool the governmental system so as to re-legitimize themselves. The UK entered the 20th century, unlike much of Europe and elsewhere by that time, without a written constitution. It is still without a written constitution today. So long, however, as Britain continued to be seen as strikingly characterized by extensive overseas clout and opportunity, unusual levels of prosperity, and evident success in war, these deficiencies and absences were widely tolerated and were even celebrated in some areas as a further demonstration of British exceptionalism. The formlessness of the British Constitution, wrote 2 senior British jurists blithely in the 1950s, has long been a matter of congratulation. But as awareness of this polity's relative decline and economic underperformance have increased, so has dissatisfaction with its governing system, and so too, to a degree, have demands for change. And as you all know, in recent decades, there have been some significant adjustments in the distribution and machinery of government in these islands. A Supreme Court was formally introduced here in 2009, a new Scottish Parliament, a new Welsh National Assembly, and a Northern Ireland Assembly have emerged, along with fresh provisions in England and Wales for directly elected mayors. Now, these are important changes, but they've also proved controversial, and they are plainly far from being comprehensive. No separate parliament has yet been created for England, which is surely one factor in the rise in recent decades of a more disgruntled English nationalism. There has been no systematic reform of the Westminster Parliament, despite the ballooning size of its House of Lords, successive scandals in the House of Commons, and the evident inequities and drawbacks of its first-past-the-post electoral system. Moreover, there seems no likelihood at present, to put it mildly, of taking devolution to what is arguably its logical conclusion and introducing here a thoroughgoing federal system. One of many reasons for this, and there are many reasons, is that were such a federal system to be inaugurated in the UK, it would likely require the introduction too of a single document codified constitution setting out how the UK was intended to function, the relations between its different devolved authorities, the rights and obligations of its various component peoples, the checks and balances on its central government and executive, and how these were to be enforced. All of this possessing the status of a fundamental law. Given the absence of such an elucidatory and comprehensive document, and as the late Law Lord Tom Bingham remarked, government in the UK can seem to function or not function in a trackless desert without map or compass. At one level, the newly introduced Celtic parliaments have rendered things more complicated without, however, diffusing separatist sentiment, if anything, the reverse. At another level, British government in London remains very centralised still by European standards, while the executive is difficult to regulate and monitor, arguably increasingly so. At yet a further level, this complex, only partially reformed system is very hard to understand, and not just as far as the general public is concerned. James Bryce, who was a famous jurist, politician, academic in the late 19th, early 20th century, once remarked that almost by definition, an uncodified constitution required more than usually well-educated and sophisticated legislators and politicians to administer it and apply it. As a parliamentary clerk, a Tory, confessed to me some years ago, it is not clear that such a situation of super sophisticated, super well-informed legislators still any more obtains, if it ever really did. The most conspicuous recent example, I think, of the perils of Tom Bingham's trackless desert is the Brexit referendum. Referenda were largely unknown in the UK before 1975, and indeed were regarded by leading politicians in both of the big traditional parties with suspicion. The fact that referenda are relatively recent imports into the British system and are not closely regulated here either by a codified constitution or by a specialist constitutional assembly helps to explain why the 2016 referendum was so poorly thought out. I mean, as a device. Whatever you think of Brexit as a cause, it is incontestable that in part because of how it was ordered and implemented, the referendum has served to exacerbate and proclaim divisions rather than to resolve them. As is well documented, many of the young voted differently in 2016 from many of the old. The highly educated voted in the main differently from the undereducated. A majority of voters in Scotland and Northern Ireland voted differently from the majority of those in England and Wales. And even in the latter two countries, Wales and England, most declining coastal towns and many rural areas voted differently from the vast majority of big cities, while London, which is after all the UK capital, voted differently from the policy choices and preference of the current UK administration. Given this disarray and the bad feelings that have been let loose as a consequence and that show little sign of subsiding, it is hardly surprising that in a list published earlier this year of the world's most stable countries, no fewer than 7 European states were put in the top 10 most stable, but not the UK, something which would surely have been unimaginable even 10 years ago. One of Jack Plum's shrewdest observations in his 1967 book was that a rise in political stability can happen in a country relatively quickly. Stability is not necessarily, as he put it, a slow coral-like growth. Exactly the same is true of political instability. It too can happen in a country relatively quickly, and the UK is currently experiencing this. There remains an important paradox, though. Because Great Britain, not the island of Ireland, I stress, but the island of Great Britain, has since 1700 experienced unusual levels of stability of a sort, a long immunity from civil warfare, an absence of shattering foreign invasions, mass killings, revolutions, and the like. People here, for all their various dissatisfactions, still many of them tend to retain a level of complacency and immunity. They feel, as it were, that it can't happen to them. It can't happen here. And this often unconscious and instinctive sense of security and immunity, no matter what, can bring its own dangers. Let me give you 2 examples. I return to Angela Merkel's entirely accurate observation that the world in general is becoming far more insecure and indeed more dangerous. There is the rising power of China and the real prospect of a flashpoint over Taiwan. There is the menace of Putin's Russia. There is, whether governed by Democrats or Republicans, an increasingly isolationist United States, less inclined to look benignly across the Atlantic. This is not an ideal time for different states in Europe to become more fragmented and more at odds with each other. Yet one of the striking features to me of the Brexit campaign and the political regime changes that have succeeded it is how rarely such potential global menaces are seriously and comprehensively acknowledged and canvassed. In this and other respects, so-called global Britain appears rather self-indulgently insular. There is still a sense that it can't happen to us. We are safe. A similar syndrome, again it seems to me, also affects Scottish nationalism, where I, a young idealistic Scot, I might well be pro-independence. But as an historian, I do cringe slightly when Scottish nationalist friends assure me that once Scotland is independent, the Scots and the English will become much better friends. Ah. How on earth can they know? From the Middle Ages to 1745, sustained periods of peace between England and Scotland were very much the exception. In the past, this was a very dangerous, violent frontier, and violent border disputes in other parts of Europe, even now, are scarcely unknown. Yet potential risks of this sort are rarely discussed in the Scottish media, any more than the English and Welsh media devote much serious attention to what exactly it will mean if a third of the present land mass of Great Britain becomes once again an entirely separate entity. Such insouciance can be seen again as a product, a drawback indeed, of this island's once protracted and relative stability. So what is to be done? In his 2015 book, The Confidence Trap, David Runciman of this university writes that there are two stories that can be told about democracy. One of obvious success and one of pessimism and fear. In reality, he suggests success and failure often go hand in hand. But what is always crucial, he continues, is what people think and that they believe. Rather similar observations could be made about British political stability. In regard to this entity too, success on the one hand and failure and failings on the other have tended to go hand in hand and to a degree still do. However, what was once widely thought and believed about this political and governmental system has in recent decades come under more serious strain. Now, it may be that these strains will, in the near future, result in a set of existential shocks in these islands that will themselves force a series of reforms. If a majority of Scots in the future vote for independence, some leading nationalists have suggested that they will also opt for a written constitution there and possibly for a Scottish republic. If, in addition, a majority in Northern Ireland opts to rejoin the rest of Ireland, this will likely demand the making of a new Irish political constitution, which will leave just England and Wales as the only countries remaining of the current UK still without a modern written constitution, a position that might be unlikely to stand for very long. In other words, we may be in for a period of perhaps creative instability. But if such epic existential shocks to the system do not occur, and if there is nonetheless greater eagerness in the near future on the part of the UK public and its politicians to explore more systematic reforms, what then? Let me suggest, in conclusion, that if we want to encourage more people here to have what J.H. Plum styled a greater sense of possession in this state, in this UK, we need to provide in several ways for a more plural political system. If we want to make everyone feel that potentially they have a place at the table, we might think of a more plural perspective in at least 4 areas, though there could be many more. First of all, it seems to me that both the US and the UK have actually suffered from, at least recently, from holding to kinds of two-party systems which no longer approximate to the range of views. Now, of course, there isn't a two-party system in the UK anymore, but much of the political system still works as though it was just a two-party system. We have an electoral system for Westminster that allows single parties to dominate government for very long times, and candidates of single parties to dominate certain constituencies for decades. Safe seats. This is a recipe for allowing people to feel excluded, that their voices are just not there and being counted. I personally think that an electoral system that would afford more coalition governments would be a better route to go. I am entirely unmoved by the argument that coalition governments always breed disaster and instability. Large parts of the world have coalition governments. Moreover, Britain had coalition governments for most of the 1850s and 1860s, which was probably the height of its power. Secondly, we do, I believe, need to explore federal solutions. I know they're difficult, but there you are. And for all sorts of reasons, we also need to explore a codified constitution as a way of engaging the people better. But it's important, again, to recognize the issue of plurality Written and unwritten constitutions are often counterpoised. In fact, most systems have elements of writtenness and elements of unwrittenness. We need to shift the balance, I believe, here more towards writtenness. I think, too, we want more pluralism in terms of what has been called global Britain and what on earth that might mean. I don't think it means battleships anymore, never mind a royal yacht. But surely what one could do, thinking of global Britain creatively, is think of other ways in which a substantial but far more modest polity, like the UK now, can still express itself in the globe in a useful way. There would be many ways of doing that. I lived in Sweden about 4 or 5 years ago and was struck by how the Swedes, who have their own problems, had nonetheless devised ways. And after all, Sweden once had a great empire too. But Sweden has reinvented itself. Things like the Nobel Prize, which focus the world's attention on Sweden at particular times and gets it talked about. There's no reason why the UK shouldn't do the same. And of course, part of global Britain has to be multiple alliances, including alliances with the rest of Europe. Putting eggs in one basket does not work. But I think of the need for more pluralism in a final respect. Self-evidently, the future does not belong to people of my age. But the future does belong for those of you who are in the audience and who are much, much younger than me. Talking to undergraduates in Princeton, which is where I work, I'm struck by how many of the students I converse with are in some ways intensely politicized. But for them, politics is about global causes. It's about the environment. It's about Black Lives Matter. It's getting rid of poverty, or as much as one can, in the so-called, or once called, Third World. But when it comes to domestic politics, they are often contemptuous, and they just don't want to go there. I mean, I've lost count of how many students have told me, all politicians are the same, domestic politics, waste of time, nothing ever happens, it always goes on and on and on. I've got other kind of causes I want to champion. Well, again, how about a more plural vision? It is perfectly possible, it is absolutely right in this more globalized world to campaign for global causes. But it is absolutely imperative also to take an interest in the domestic politics of whatever space of the globe you happen to live in and belong to. Politicians are not all the same. Governments really do make a difference. It is absolutely essential that young and intelligent and energetic people, like some of the people, I'm sure you're all energetic, but, you know, the younger ones I'm talking about, it is absolutely vital that you intervene and make a future politics better. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. That was such a typically fascinating, wide-ranging and challenging lecture. I mean, you've painted on a fantastically broad canvas there. In practical terms here, we have a few minutes, and a few minutes only. I'm under strict instructions to get you upstairs for a drink fairly soon. So we may not have time for everyone's question, but you can put some of those to Linda in person, I'm sure. Let me just start by, as well as thanking you for that, just commenting on how interesting I think it is, and obviously unusual, to talk about the concept of political stability. I mean, that is an idea that we are all in different ways thinking about in the current moment in the UK, and have been clearly since the Brexit referendum and arguably before that, the 2014 referendum. But it's not an idea that gets sustained focus or examination. So I think there's something very interesting about that. And I should add, I would heartily endorse Linda's commendation of Plum's book, which I have to confess I looked at again in anticipation of this lecture, having not read it since being an undergraduate, and I was really very taken by partly the way in which it's written, the verve, but these incredibly interesting questions that are posed there about political stability, but also the relationship between socio and economic change and stability in that particular period. But there are lots of questions I'd love to put to Linda, and I'm going to put some of them later, but I'm really keen to get other voices into the conversation. So it's hard for me to spot individuals, partly because you have masks on and the lights are in my eye, but would anyone like to go first? If we can just collect 2 or 3, I think we'll have time for short comments and or questions.
I'll need your pen.
Oh, you have my pen as well, yeah. So let me just look out. I can see Jim Gallagher here, who knows many things about many of the issues you've been covering.
Linda, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. It was a real tour de force, and I couldn't hope to be as wide-ranging as you, so I'm going to narrow down the question. One of the consequences of political stability, I'm guessing, is constitutional continuity. And that's very true of the UK. We still have bits of our constitution that we found lying about in the Middle Ages, and we've never reconstructed it. Now, you seem to be arguing, I think, that we should reconstruct it, that we should have a ground zero moment and codify the whole thing. I'm a little sceptical about that, and I want to ask you whether you want to consider an alternative. And that is that our constitution does change. It changes in occasional, rather slow ways at various constitutional moments. And I wonder if you think we're at such a constitutional moment now, and it's time, not necessarily for a complete revision, but for some big and significant changes. And I would agree with you that pluralism, particularly geographical pluralism, is certainly one of those.
I can't see anyone's hand up right now, Linda. So, oh yes, I can see him here, yeah. Charles.
Far-reaching lecture. I was uncertain if you were saying it was the Constitution that had led to what I think you're saying is a threat of instability rather than actual instability, or are you saying that other forces are coming into play and therefore we need a new constitution? There are 2 views, it seems to me, that our constitution has dealt so much better than other countries with the various pressures on it. For example, we have avoided extremism in this country. We've Brexited, which was difficult, but probably difficult more for the politicians than the public. The big constitutional issue of what happens in Scotland, which is where, on the face of it, the constitution is big in play, is an issue about how the Scottish people feel their future is best served. And although it's a constitutionally reflected question, ultimately it's not a, quote, failure of the Constitution. It's because the Scots want a different structure going forward. And I'm keen to ascertain to what extent you think it's our Constitution that's failed, or to what extent you think it's other pressures that now need a new Constitution.
Thanks, that's a great question. I can see one more hand. This is going to be the final question. Sorry, Nicola, it's right at the top of the... you saved me from abusing the chair's position. I was going to put my question. So there's somebody here.
So I totally agree and foresee the stabilising effect of the Constitution. But in this world that you've painted, which is a very polarised position, how do you see going forwards to codify a constitution from a very polarised state?
Good question. So, do you want to take those three?
Well, thank you very much. These are wonderful questions, which lecturers always say, of course, when it means that they're not quite sure how to answer them. Let me say that I'm not an automatic fan of a codified constitution. And even when they exist, and after all, they do exist, depending on definition, in all but 3 or possibly all but 2 countries on the globe. So other people are coping with them. But I liked your distinction about would it be wiser not to push for a codified constitution, but for some big and significant changes. That would, of course, be possibly equally difficult. What I think a codified constitution can do, if you get it right, and the follow-through is good, is that it can serve as some kind of educative force. It can instruct people in what the system is. What is it supposed to be? Because I sometimes ask people, who are highly sophisticated and educated and say, okay, you've got 5 minutes, explain the UK political system to somebody who doesn't know it. In a few sentences, how would you do it? Very, very hard. And whether that means, okay, we'll have big and significant changes, we won't have a fully codified constitution, but perhaps we'll go for a charter, a document of points. But I think something written down, something that people can see on the screen, has a value. And the makers of the Indian Constitution after 1947 were convinced of that precisely because so many people in the Indian subcontinent, in part, were undereducated, illiterate, that having something written down that could be read to them or that they could get lawyers to explain was going to be an educative device. And to a degree, I think there's problems with the Indian system even now, but it's lasted longer than many. Constitutions and instability, and constitutions and stability. I suppose what I wanted to do, in part, and it's a horrible term, problematize, which is often used in America, but I did want to problematize this prevailing theology, as I call it, whereby our unique gradualist constitution diffused problems, and we were able to surmount all the difficulties that other people suffered. As I tried to suggest, I think there's other reasons as well that we surmounted difficulties. I think without the empire and its opportunities, the relative stability of Britain in the 18th and 19th century and the early 20th century might have been much more difficult. It was a safety valve. I also wanted to suggest that having, stability is one thing, stasis is another. How how do you get the balance right? And how do you get people discussing these things and thinking about it? At the moment, we have an unfortunate situation where we have a Prime Minister who, because he talks like this, just says, oh, this is just frivolity. Most people aren't interested. I mean, what we've got to do is get things working better. As if for some reason constitutional issues weren't about making things better. So trying to get these issues more broadly canvassed, seriously looked at, argued over, seems to me one way to go. Though I do think that if the gun goes off, if Scotland does become independent, then everything will get thrown into the air. And this will be, if you like, aftershocks partly caused by Brexit.
Thanks, Linda. That's a pretty good note to end on, I think. So I'm just going to hand over to Sally. My final thought is that I can't help but think the current Prime Minister would be very flattered by the parallel with Walpole. I think he'd love that.
All I'm going to do is say we're just literally pausing the conversation. We could go on for ages, but what we're going to do is go on over a drink upstairs in the upper hall and then over dinner. So I know this conversation will get noisy as the evening goes on, because as ever, Linda's been hugely challenging, and of course, as ever, is forcing us to challenge some of our previous thinking, as in my experience she always does. So can I just finish this moment by saying again, thank you so much indeed, Linda. That was just as we hoped, and it was really stimulating. So can we?